Hello and welcome to Sean White's Solar and Energy Storage Podcast. Today we have David Chen, and he is an energy and environment technology professional. And we could just let people know too that we were talking before we started recording, and I thought what he said was so relevant and exciting and entertaining to me. And we're going to have David Chen go back and explain what he's up to.
Flashback.
I used to work for a company called Murata Electronics, and my role there was looking at clean tech, climate tech, and anything related to that for this company and provide a future view and looking at, 7 to 10 years out. Where should this Japanese company invest in order to understand the market better, but also to find the technology that could lead them into this space? And Murata is a very large components manufacturing company that makes capacitors and other devices for consumer electronics mainly, and they own 40% of the capacitor market, the very small electronic capacitors that go into all of our devices, including cars and phones and computers. And so in that capacity, I had to build a understanding of hydrogen, of blue economy, blue ocean, also, circular economy and other things like that. And I was always thinking about bleeding edge technologies, business models, and consideration of how anthropology and everything else fits into that so that we have a better understanding of which technologies have the best chance of succeeding and what are the conditions of success or failure. But I went from there, that theoretical point of view, to this company called Cold Electric, which is a Taiwanese company. And well, first of all, the reason I was interested is because I'm Taiwanese. A second reason is because I do have a relationship with the founders. And, I called them up to ask them what they were doing. Like, why did I decide to go into this crowded business? And I heard their pitch and I became very intrigued and decided that I wanted to move out of the theoretical and into the more near-term applicable technology approach, and or basically, moving from this viewpoint of the future to what we can do now. And so Cold Electric is a battery company that's fully integrated, which is something I haven't seen outside of, say, China. They take the active material and they make their own cathode, anode, electrolyte, and they put all of that into a cell, into a pouch cell that they then put together into a module, which is then incorporated into a overall system. And they even do their own EMS and BMS. And so that full integration, I think, is interesting because of the ease of operation of it, the ease of maintenance of it is because it's single source, single vendor. But also, one of the things I realized while working in my previous job is that as we move this country to one that's less fossil fuel and more energy, battery has to become a very big part of that. And if we don't have the supply chain here in the US to support that, I think of it as an economic security and a national security issue. So, wanting to come back with this company to bring some of that knowledge back to the US, I felt was the right move for me in this time in my career.
Great.
End of flashback.
Some of the things that I liked what you were talking about too was like you were talking about climate tech, future view, capacitors that are used in consumer electronics, hydrogen, circular economy, business models, anthropology. I really like anthropology, which is, you don't have too many people talking about that when they're talking about things like energy storage and solar and renewables and all that kind of stuff. So that's pretty neat. We could tie it into that and figuring out which tech is going to have the best chance of succeeding. So I've been listening to a book by Ray Kurzweil, his latest. You might know who that is. He's a guy that's really good at predicting the future. Do you know Ray Kurzweil?
I have not, because I've been so deep into this other stuff. I have not looked at his stuff.
Yeah, he's a guy that kind of invented like the laser printer or something, and he was a Google technology officer. I think he was like the CTO of Google for a while, something like that. And I think it was like 1999 or something about like there. He wrote a book called The Singularity is Near. And then now he just came out with The Singularity is Nearer. And so I've been listening to that audio book about his different predictions, and he's been pretty accurate, I think, at predicting the future. So that's
Yeah.
kind of a neat thing. And he's not really talking about renewable energy that much. He does talk about it a little bit, but it's some pretty interesting stuff that he talks about that I'm interested in. So that's kind of neat.
So it's anthropology and sociology, because where I was thinking there is that the demand side always has more of it's the more complex part of the equation to solve,
Hmm.
right? Because we focused everything on the supply chain on the manufacturing side. But as we see in EV, when the demand is not there, everything kind of falls apart a little bit. And we have to wait for the demand to catch up. And so the success of any company is a matter of timing for when the customer is ready to buy and when you have enough capacity to sell. And that timing piece of it is what we're always trying to get right. And that's why companies are failing. And then the same ideas come back 5, 6 years later. And, when the market is ready and they succeed. Case in point, one of the first unicorns was Better Place in 2000. I don't know if you remember them.
I'll let you tell us about that.
Well, Better Place was born out of a TED Talk where it was the first battery company, and it moved to Israel and they created a bunch of, they did some of the first prototyping of battery swapping and the charging networks and things like that. And people invested $1 billion in it. But in the end, it failed because there were not enough EV cars there to really, support that infrastructure. And only recently, so a lot of those concepts that were born of that are now coming back and now are seeing more success. In the early part of my career, when we were looking at energy efficiency with TXU Energy, one of the things I kept noticing was some of the building principles that were coming out were coming from ideas that were born in the 1900s, orienting the house north and south, using straw as insulation.
Well, I thought that was more like the caveman days.
Yeah. So those are, the good ideas tend to come back and stay around.
Uh-huh. Yeah, straw bale houses. And I was just looking back at somebody wants me to do a DIY solar class, and somebody had me do that before. They went on Eventbrite. They got people to come install their solar system for free, and I was like the coach. It was kind of fun. And then Solar Today magazine even wrote a story on that. So I was just looking back at it because somebody else wants me to do something like that too. But yeah, the straw house, the three little pigs, all that kind of stuff, it's been around for
Yeah.
a long time. Yeah.
Earth houses, for example, are,
Uh-huh.
built on those principles. So,
Uh-huh. Yep. Yep. Yeah. And facing your house south, what is it? The Anasazi cliff dwellings from thousands of
yeah.
years ago in Colorado. So the Native Americans were facing their houses south. And I always tell people that, the first caveman that pointed their cave south was the original solar guy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Even before the Egyptians had Ra, sun god Ra. So, yeah.
And back to that point about just the timing of the market, I think right now, from a renewable energy perspective, solar panels, for example, have been around since the 70s. It's 50 years old now. But only recently has it really, 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 really taken off. We've had windmills for hundreds of years doing work for us in various ways. But only in the last 20 years or 10 years has it really, evolved and changed and really taken off. So that's a matter of the market being ready for
Hmm.
us to really expand. And I think across the clean energy space, there's a lot of that timing issue and why the government has invested in the full supply chain to get it there. Where the Chinese have really succeeded, I feel, is that they've created the market as well as seeded the supply chain through heavy incentives and guaranteed loans and all kinds of other things like that. And the fact that they took a full market view on that, for example, HVAC or HVDC investments throughout the country at the same time they're investing in renewables, created some very aggressive growth in solar panels and batteries and transmission and energy. And that's why they're winning right now in that space, right?
Yeah, you mentioned HVDC, so that's high voltage DC. And I never thought of that, like how close it is to HVAC, which is not high voltage alternating current, but it's heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. So that's interesting. I never thought of that. So, yeah.
Well, transmission comes in two flavors, right? HVAC and HVDC.
Uh-huh.
So there are two different versions. DC
So
is
you
more,
do use HVAC for talking about high voltage alternating current?
yeah,
As it,
yeah,
I just always think of that as heating, ventilation, and air conditioning.
right.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, it does get confusing with all the acronyms that we throw around
Uh-huh.
across the different areas. But yeah, I mean, HVDC is one that China's invested very heavily in, and it's enabled a lot of the renewable energy generation and markets over there. So there's a lot of areas where we're running behind because we've taken more of a market approach rather than more of a government directed approach. And markets are messy, and markets take time, and markets take, there's a timing aspect to it as well. So that's why right now it's both exciting and scary.
Uh-huh.
In
Yeah.
many markets.
Yeah, it is kind of crazy. Like if you're too early and you have a great idea, you're a failure. And then if you
Yeah,
copy that person's idea 10 years later, you're a great success.
exactly.
And that might be the difference between Google and somebody that we forgot.
Tesla and GM, right?
Yeah, uh-huh.
Because
Yeah,
GM had the first EV car. Actually, Ford had the first EV car, right? In the 1900s when cars were coming out, they were mostly electric.
yeah, some old lady in the 1910 or something cranking her or not cranking her car. That was the benefit of the electric vehicle is you didn't have to
Right,
crank it, you know?
right.
Yeah.
100 years later, now, Tesla took that idea, made it cool, and now everybody's driving a Tesla.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I'm guilty. And they also mentioned anthropology. And so that is, I guess, anthro, it means human. So the study of humans, sociology, that would be the study of social things. We say that we're in the Anthropocene, that's the time of the humans. Like if they go back in a million years from now and look at a different layer of the Grand Canyon and the one that's all full of plastic,
Yeah.
that's us. Yeah.
And, it's more applying the principles of observation than going back religiously or academically and looking at what happened in certain points in time. But it's an understanding that, adoption may take longer than we expect, and what are the fears that may be driving some of that adoption, or that may be an obstacle to that adoption. And, how quickly do adoption cycles happen in certain areas, and are the conditions there, and when can we expect that to be there, and being able to go peel back a few more layers from a investment perspective in order to look at that. As an entrepreneur, you just want to go fast and you want to be able to hopefully hit it at the right time. But as a very risk averse investor, a safer investor, you would want to fully understand what the trajectory of demand may be as well as supply.
So, where are things going in your view, since you're a person that's predicting the future? Where should I lay my money?
It's less about predicting the future than it is about helping people understand the risks. And where I saw challenges are that, the pace of change, between the need for change and the pace of change, there is a big gap. And we all have these 2050, 2030, 2050 goals that are going to be very, very difficult to meet unless, with very significant obstacles along the way. And one of them is going to be the price of energy overall. All the industrial growth that we've seen in the US and around the world has been related to the cost of energy. Cheaper energy creates more opportunity because the products become cheaper. Well, in this period of transition from fossil fuel to gas, I mean, there isn't a single transition that is entirely smooth. And the transitions on average are very messy, right?
Hmm.
Whether it be political or geographical, all transitions are very messy. And the complexity of what we're trying to accomplish here is also going to be messy. And there's going to be fear on one side as prices go up through, energy inflation as we support two different systems in that transition. And that's going to be, in my opinion, an inflection point for us. Like we're going to have to decide as a society how are we going to move forward as these energy prices go up, because they will go up. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. There's going to be periods of time where it's going to go up. And as things scale up and as we become more efficient, they'll fall again. And that's always been the case in a lot of, when you transition from one form of government to another, there's a period of chaos before you get peace. So I see that happening as we transition through some of these areas. And then, things like reskilling people for the work that we need, that's going to be an area of challenge as well. The will to make the changes that we need is going to be both financial and a little bit of FUD, right? Fear,
Uncertainty, doubt?
uncertainty, doubt, sorry. Fear,
That's right.
uncertainty, and doubt. And that is something that is here in the US has been heavily politicized for different gains. And what I've found is in this tech space, there's actually people on both sides that are interested in moving this forward for different reasons, whether it's climate change or national security or just that it makes good business. Both sides want these industries to succeed outside of certain industries that are going to be on the wrong side of that. And even though we're doing it for the different reasons, the end goal is the same, which is more solar, more renewable, and more battery. So that to me is a positive. And I think that if we can come to a common understanding and this market hits a certain point, we'll be much more successful.
So one of the things that you talked about is the price going up and then the price going down. And I see the price of solar going from the most expensive electricity in the mix. So maybe somewhere around 2009, you see a chart where it's the most expensive. Then you see a chart that says 2019, it's the cheapest, and that might be in a desert somewhere. And then we get more solar on the grid and more wind on the grid, then we need to combine it with energy storage. And so right now, with electric vehicles and everything too in the mix, we see energy storage going down, and that's all about, mass production and bringing prices down. So the price going up also for somebody that's concerned about climate change or somebody that's in the solar industry, price going up is probably a good thing as far as like, kilowatt hours. Politically, it's not a good thing, but like just from somebody like sitting in my chair, from my point of view, I tell my students, it's like, don't worry, when the electric bill goes up, that's more business.
Sure.
And I'm not trying to say that electricity should be expensive, but also they say that solar energy is the cheapest form of electricity, or you could say solar and wind is right now. But then you do have to add it to energy storage, which makes the price go up. So you can turn on the lights when it's not windy and when it's not sunny. So do you have like a time frame for that too? Price going up and then down?
So from an observational perspective, it's less about the unit cost per kilowatt hour and more about the CapEx part of it and the cost of upgrading the system in order to enable that world you're talking about. Because our infrastructure is old in some certain areas, it's past its prime. Those areas have to be upgraded. Our utilities are not, the way they're built or the way they're organized. In some places, it's going to be very difficult to invest in those upgrades, and they'll only do them as needed. So that part is what I'm talking about from where it's going to get more expensive first before it starts to fall.
So like the transmission and the distribution?
Transmission, distribution. There's certain things that we have to do on that side of the equation in order to make things better. Also, the cost to upgrade across residential and commercial areas to support that world that you're talking about is going to require a bigger workforce. It's going to require a lot more investment in distribution, or not distribution from the electricity standpoint, but from the supply chain standpoint. And so those are the kind of things that I'm talking about where it's more infrastructure. On the fossil fuel side, it's, a lot of the bigger companies aren't investing in new exploration. So that will only get more expensive. And as many things as we have that rely on fossil fuel besides transportation, that's going to make everything more expensive. So, that's what I'm talking about from a cost risk. I see that all these ancillary product markets that are going to be related to fossil fuel and energy, those are going to have to go up for a little bit.
Okay, great. And one thing that I've been studying about too is with all of the energy storage on the grid and energy storage prices going down, and if we could harness vehicle to grid, that would be another thing that would help with this. And so we could reduce the amount of infrastructure we even need on the grid, even if we were using triple the amount of electricity, if we had a whole bunch of energy storage in all the right places. So they call that transmission and distribution deferral when you're talking about energy storage. And so, like, just for instance, an analogy would be your average house, 240 volts, 10,000 kilowatt hours a year, and that's less than 5 amps continuous, but you have a 200 amp service because you're going to be turning a whole bunch of things on and turning a whole bunch of things off all the time. But if you could get it set up and have virtual power plants and control all these things, you could actually make it so your house only needs a 5 amp service, which sounds totally insane to any electrician. But just to kind of make a point, and then, I'm talking about residential, a house or something like that, but that also would go for any part of the grid. So if we had large amounts of energy storage, whether it be in cars, whether it be in large energy storage systems, we could just, in a way, reduce the amount of transmission and distribution that we need, even if we tripled the amount of electricity passing through the grid, because most of the time it's not this peak time when we need it. It's not when all the air conditioners are on, it's not a heat wave. And I have 85 kilowatt hours in my car that's doing nothing 23 and a half hours a day, stuff like that.
And, to that point, I agree that vehicle to grid and, distributed energy systems are going to be a important factor to modernizing this grid and moving us away from these more aging infrastructure. The question is who can afford it and who can pay for it?
Yeah, and I think it's very important to upgrade the infrastructure, especially having high voltage lines going from the East Coast to the West Coast where the sun's up in one place and it's blowing wind in the other and nothing's happening in another place. That replaces energy storage in a certain way.
Yeah, I mean, you're still going to need the lines, you're still going to need the
Mm.
equipment, so that investment still has to be made. It's a deferral. You're kicking the can down the road.
Yeah, and even without having any electric vehicles or solar or wind, we still need to upgrade the
Right.
grid.
And, solar and batteries still represent a significant cost, even as cheap as they are right now.
Mm.
So the utilities are more resistant to them. Well, not resistant, but there are some challenges working with the utilities getting on the grid with your batteries. And, because the permitting processes in some places are extremely long. And, it's just those growing pains from that transition of utilities getting used to understanding how batteries and renewables, model into their system and how they can best use that. So we will get there. It's going to take more penetration, it's going to take more time and more experimentation before we get there.
Yeah, and perhaps we need more progressive policies, and it's probably hard from a utilities point of view to make changes because you're sort of a natural monopoly, and it's hard to make a case for making a big change for the decision makers there, I would think.
It's partly that, but it's also, the rate case models sometimes take forever to get through for you to make certain changes. But I mean, the utility's primary role is to deliver electricity and reliability. And so when you're talking about intermittent sources of energy that could, for a grid that's so complex to manage, they get very nervous, especially when you have to do it across so many smaller points. The analogy I usually use is if you think about our grid as our highway system, and, basically we build highway systems here in Texas to accommodate rush hour traffic, right? Which is why some of the highways have 6 lanes going each way in certain areas to help with that congestion. That's what they're doing with their transmission and distribution system in order to maintain stability and reliability. Now we're asking that same grid to not only add that capacity, but also be smart enough to know how to adjust those lanes according to which way the traffic may be flowing at the time. And, now it has to be wider, it has to be more modern, and it has to go both ways. So that is a tremendous amount of complexity and risk. And, utilities in general are less risk averse because the consequences of failure is so dire and drastic. So I don't know that it's the monopoly. Part of it probably is, but I also think that the people that are responsible for some of these decisions have to weigh it against the potential instability to the grid. And they're going to be overly cautious because of that. And that's what we have to help them understand that, these can be a tool. This is a friend. This is a tool. This is just another piece of equipment.
Yeah, I'm not saying that also that the monopoly is a bad thing. It's just a natural thing. It's not like you're going to
Yeah.
have 4 sets of power lines going down your street. That would be pretty ugly. I think I've
Yeah.
seen some pictures in New York City, like the way that it was in 1900 or something like that. And it was like just a
Yeah.
mess of wires. And so we don't want that. But it's just Yeah, it's like the technology has moved so fast. If you zoom out a little bit, I mean, it's just incredible how fast it's moved. And so we need to catch up with the technology, with the policy. And there's all these different public utilities commissions and utilities. And like, how do you make these huge changes? And then we need somebody that's really good at coding and making the software, deciding how to make things automatically shift and when to dump this battery out and when to charge your car and when to turn off the air conditioner for 5 minutes.
Right.
We interrupt you for a very important announcement. Sean White's Solar and Energy Storage Podcast has been brought to you by Sean White's Solar and Energy Storage Podcast. That's right, Sean White is sponsoring his own podcast, and he wants to remind you to go check out some of his classes. You can go to SolarSean, that's Solar, SEAN.com, and then click on the links to check out his classes. You can check out his heat spring classes, and you can also hire him to teach classes for you, like at your company, something like that. Now back to the show.
And so the pace of change in utility as a result is slower than the pace of change out here in the technology world. And, at some point in time, they have to converge, but, right now we're feeling the pain of that. It's not just policy, it's also our models, our skills, our knowledge, our frame of reference has to change. Those are the kind of things that have to be done. And the patchwork nature of our grid, with the overall grid and all these munis and independent grid operators here and there, it's not like the national grid in China where everything is done as a central planning, right? Here, there's so many people weighing in on it that it is so complex.
Yeah, and we have so many different utilities and states and public utilities commissions and policies.
Permitting processes, I mean, all of that is different.
Of course, yeah. Yeah.
Models, how, voltage, like there's so many things that could be different.
Yeah. And I figure eventually it'll all fall into place. One of my big wish, and I've said it before, is that when they do make a change to policy, when it affects, like, say, the rates, like the California going to net metering 3, that it's kind of a natural thing that it's going to get there someday. But to make a sudden change where all of a sudden for exporting your energy, it's just completely different overnight causes the solar coaster to go down. And it was so much better when we had the California Solar Initiative, which was quite a while ago now. And it had this step down process. So it was just like once so much more solar was installed, it just drops down a little bit. And so it was a gradual process. So it wasn't this overnight thing where it's like
soft landing, right?
Yeah. I mean, you don't want to like drive your
Yeah.
airplane straight into the ground.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And it causes like layoffs and it hurts families and things like that. It gives the industry a bad reputation. And then you get all these companies kind of working against themselves where they're saying, sign up now because it's going to be terrible next month. And then next month comes around and they're like, well, I didn't really mean that. I need you to sign up now.
Right. And to some extent, I do agree that we do need to ramp down certain things and just for the health of the market. Because if the market gets too addicted to giveaways, to subsidization, then it has no incentive to improve on their pricing or on their models or on anything like that. But I do agree that having too much too quickly doesn't do anybody any good. I think as a startup, the most important thing is stability. I don't want the market to change so much that my business model and my company just goes under, but I need it to be stable long enough so that I know how to plan for the future.
Yeah, and then I remember too with the investment tax credit, the 30% tax credit, how they had it stepping down, and then all of a sudden there was just going to be one deadly step, and it takes years to design some of these big power plants, and it's just nice to know what's going to happen in the future and to have gradual step downs. And then of course we have politics and all that kind of stuff, and in fact, we're recording before we're going to be released, and this will be released after the election, so we don't know what's going to happen there. A lot of times too, it turns out to be a lot of talk. And then no matter who's in charge, the solar industry still lives. So,
yeah. And it's because, the efficiencies in manufacturing of solar in China and batteries are really making that the case. But that to me represents another risk because if we're so addicted to low pricing because of what's being done in China, then we become overly reliant on China in the future.
Yeah, I was just thinking about too, that was probably a good transition into what you're doing.
Sure.
So with cold electric and batteries.
Yeah, so Cold Electric was actually the founder started this about 15 years ago. She purchased the assets from Formosa Plastics at the time, who was divesting of this side of the business. And she's been working on perfecting the battery specifics or the characteristics for a while with a focus on stationary storage and safety. And this 15 years ago, everybody else was still focused on EVs, and this was still, the stationary side of it was still a dream. She was already working on trying to figure out how do we do stationary storage in the safest way possible. And only recently, like 3 years ago, have they really decided to go out. They started building a factory, and now we have about 300 megawatt hours of capacity with designs on a gigafactory in Taoyuan, Taiwan. And, we're looking at sites here in the US as well for a gigafactory. But she wanted to build a integrated product starting from the cell all the way up. And the founder's history is in manufacturing. We're faith-based entrepreneurs who want to use this business to do more good. And so with that focus, she decided that instead of just making cells or focusing on any one part of it, she wanted to make a product that was independent of China. And all the parts, we try to make as many of the parts internally as we can, including the container and the BMS and the EMS. And those where we don't have expertise, we try to source from, Japan and Europe and US. And so this integrated approach allows us to be more flexible, allows us to control more of the cost, and allows us to focus on safety, which was innovative at the time. When everybody else was focused on EVs and energy density, she was focused on how do we make this product more safe. As a result, we have a product that has less gas release during thermal runaway, but hey, we've also made our thermal runaway threshold higher so that, there's less chance of thermal runaway. The electrolyte has no flammability. The formula itself is non-flammable.
Yeah, thermal runaway is when a battery gets hot and kind of like burns, I guess you could say.
Yeah, thermal runaway happens when the battery starts to degrade too much and dendrite starts to form within the battery.
And so that would short the battery out.
Yeah, short the battery. When it shorts, it heats up. When it heats up, lithium becomes a gas, and then that, with the right spark, becomes explosive. So thermal
Mhm.
runaway, and it's a chemical fire, which is the runaway part of it, right?
Yeah, and you
So
don't want one battery to catch another one on fire, whether it be the cell or the pack, the module.
exactly. So we were saying that thermal runaway is a big concern, and UL 9540A is the certification test that battery makers have to go through at the cell, module, unit, and system level. And depending on the results of each of those levels, you may have to perform the next level of testing. But it's a understanding of how the cell will behave in conditions related to a thermal runaway. And it's a thorough test. It doesn't go all the way, which is why NFPA 855 is in place to help people understand, fire protection.
Yeah, and so NFPA 855, the standard for stationary energy storage systems.
Right. And so safety, it becomes more of a concern because of, the nature of the fires are chemical, so that it's harder to put out. And so as a result, fire departments are hesitant in some places to allow batteries near populated areas. And so the safety part of it, I believe, is something that is hard to value and hard to measure at the moment. But I think it's becoming more and more of a concern as we see and hear about stationary fires and car fires around the world. So our founder,
Who's your founder?
her name's Margaret Chen.
Margaret Chin. Great.
Yeah, Margaret Chen and her son Phil Chen. Phil is our CEO and Margaret Chen is the founder.
Great.
So this focus on safety started at the chemistry level because she wants to make sure that at its most fundamental base, that it is as safe as possible. And, it goes all the way up to, cell design, pack design, and system design to make sure that everything about this is as safe as can be. Now, the question is, how do we value safety as a industry, and how do we help customers understand safety And that's the challenge. And also, with the prices being as low as they are right now in the market because of the supply overcapacity in China bleeding over into this side of the business, it becomes harder and harder to make the case for that comparison. And so customers are valuing right now, lower cost systems that help the economics much better up front than they are, how do you add safety into that equation has been the question for me.
Okay. And one more thing too. You said Margaret Chen is the founder, Phil Chen is the CEO. Are you related to them?
No, I'm not.
Oh, is it just a coincidence? Is it?
Chen is like Smith. There's a ton of Smiths, there's a ton of Chens.
Okay, great. Okay. All right. And so you're talking about safety too. And you said that your electrolyte was not flammable.
Yeah, the electrolyte is non-flammable.
And how does that compare to most lithium ion batteries?
So, earlier in my career, I attended a safety demonstration where a cylindrical cell was pierced, and we saw the sparking and the fire and the smoke that came out of that. I also saw another test, a burner test, where a Bunsen burner was placed in the middle of a room with a rack on top of it. Someone in a full safety suit and a long tong dropped a cell onto that holder above the Bunsen burner and ran out of that room faster than anyone with that much equipment on because
Uh-huh.
these things tend to explode in heat because the gas expands very quickly. And so LFP in general is safer because it doesn't have that, but it still releases a lot of hydrofluorocarbons. And, that gas still has the potential to explode if you don't properly address it. So our formulation means less gas, which means less risk. And the flammability of it is, because it's non-flammable, you could put a direct flame to that electrolyte and you'll have no problem. I don't know that I've seen any other ones that can do that.
Is that a secret recipe that you have? Hmm.
It is.
Is it Coca-Cola? Because that's a secret recipe.
Except we don't have any taste testers out there trying to figure it
Yeah,
out.
I think I'm gonna volunteer not. Okay. All right. And so you're producing these in Taiwan. Taiwan is famous for semiconductor manufacturing. In fact,
Mhm.
they say that Taiwan is so good at manufacturing semiconductors, which is probably the most difficult thing in the world to manufacture, that you have to just do it perfectly, that that's one of the big concerns that the global economy has, besides all of the nice people in Taiwan. But if something happened over there, it would disrupt the whole world supply chain because your semiconductors in Taiwan are so important. So you must be very good at manufacturing over there in general.
So Taiwan has a very strong manufacturing culture in general. Semiconductor is one of those industries that Taiwan had a niche in. And, there's years of history there as well that I'm probably going to butcher if I try to attempt it. But yeah, they've become very, very good at making small semiconductors. And it's the primary job in Taiwan that everybody wants coming out of school. It
Mhm.
makes it hard to hire anything else, actually. But there's programs across universities in Taiwan devoted specifically to how to make these semiconductors. So when you get good at something, you have a full ecosystem of knowledge that you can build on top of. And that's what we need back here in the US. And I'm heartened by what the Biden administration has done in terms of its investment for the supply chain, because we do need to bring some of that knowledge base back here so that we can continue to innovate and we can continue to grow. In my previous job looking at startups, there are so many good ideas here in the US. And there's so many places that just have to go overseas to make it and make those ideas a reality because we just don't have the knowledge base here to execute effectively because we're basically learning. And that's what we need back here in the US as well. And so, there's a lot of room for improvement in the US that we have to make in order to build a self-sustaining industry.
I know I was talking to some people on the podcast about bringing Chinese PV manufacturing technology over to the US. And it's kind of ironic because in the US, we pretty much invented it.
Yeah. Batteries, same thing. Argonne National Labs, right?
Yeah, yeah.
We had the same argument against, I remember in the 90s, there was the same argument against Japan. And, for a while, it was the same argument against Taiwan. And yet we kept moving things overseas in the name of globalization without the understanding that, hey, we're also shipping away any foundation for future innovation. And, US is tremendous at making new technologies and new ideas and stretching, those ideas. But we don't have the knowledge base in some areas to make it happen.
Yeah, and then we have wise guys like David Chappelle out there saying that he wants to be able to afford to wear Nikes. He doesn't want to make Nikes. So, but but that is kind of a mentality that, we just get so addicted to having all this cheap junk that we're constantly surrounded by that ends up in a dumpster, most of it, not too much later, 10 years later or something like that, 1 year later even.
If we take that sentiment and we take what David Chappelle said and apply it to batteries and solar, what are we really doing to those industries, right?
Hmm.
Are we falling down the same path? I mean, every model that we see about the growth of this industry is dependent on the price of those things dropping in China. And so that's part of that transition that I'm talking about where it's going to be messy.
Yeah. So do you see the mess ending at some point?
That's going to be hard to tell. I mean, it all depends on, politics, policy, who's in the office in the White House. I mean, there's going to be so many things. And that's the anthropology, sociology part of it as well, which is a big unknown in some ways. And so it has to end in order for this to move forward. I just don't know when or how, but it's something we should definitely keep looking at.
So are you looking at setting up battery factories in the US right now? Is that part of your job?
That is not part of my job. There's another part of the company that is on that search committee to look for a location and build a gigafactory here in the US.
Hmm.
And that gigafactory will be solely dedicated to stationary storage systems and not be EV or anything else related. Because the integrated portion of the company in that same factory will be making everything from the cell all the way up to the containerized systems.
Hmm. And so you're probably waiting for politics to settle down a little bit, I'd imagine, to see what happens with the Inflation Reduction Act, which is awesome for building factories and battery factories and solar
Right.
module factories and things like that. So once you decide to set up a battery factory, what does that look like, or how long do you think that would take? I know a lot of people are setting up factories for renewables in what they call the red states, or a lot of states in the South and things like that. I was just, a friend of mine is in Indiana right now setting up a solar module factory.
So, I'm not part of that process, so I don't want to speak too much to that. I do know that right now the tentative plan is to be operational 2027.
2027. Cool.
Yeah,
Okay.
in the US. And in the meantime, we'll be, I believe 27. It's 24 now, and the 24. Yeah, about 2027 is where I think it'll be. And then we'll be supplying from Taiwan at the moment.
Hmm. So are people able to buy your equipment here in the US right now? Is it being installed?
So we're looking for demonstration projects right now to demonstrate our technology and our benefit. And so we've been in discussion with a couple of people around what that would look like, but we're open to people who would be willing to put one of our products on their property. The other part of this that we didn't really talk about is not just the hardware, but it's the business model of batteries. And the reason I bring that up is I'm looking not just to sell this battery, I'm looking for projects right now with utility or with customer that push the envelope of the business model. And it could be battery as a service, but one of the things I've been thinking about is I think of the battery as a Swiss Army knife. But what we do with the battery is we sell it based on one or two or three of the functions of that battery. So it's akin to saying, I'm giving you a Swiss Army knife, but I'm charging it according to you using the corkscrew or the switchblade. That's it. And so, what I want to know or what I want to understand is how do we push that idea and get the most utility out of the battery? And so, instead of the battery as a hardware, let's think of the battery more as a service solution and as one part of that service solution. And pieces of it are here and there across the US, but I'm looking for new ideas like, maybe there's a multifamily collaboration with the utility that could provide both the resiliency tool for the utility as well as a incentive for the multifamily to install more EV charging. Because EV charging is right now solely available to people who are in single family homes, or more readily available to those with single family homes. And if you're in a multifamily home, there's much less incentive to have an EV at the
Sure.
moment. And as that grows, it becomes more of an issue. So is there a different business model there that we could pursue? And so those are the things that I would like to explore long term to help justify the value of our product versus just the hardware cost.
Yeah, I think so many people just think of energy storage as being time shifting. So the sun's out, you fill up the battery, the sun's going down, you start using the battery. But
Yeah,
there's so many different applications. Some of the first applications for the large energy storage systems were things like frequency regulation, where you're just sending out little pulses of electricity or taking in pulses of electricity to change the frequency of the grid when the wind blows harder or doesn't blow as hard. That was the big 100 kilowatt hour battery that was in Australia that was kind of made famous 5 years ago or something like that. And there's like different types of grid support. We talk about reactive power, power
yeah,
factor, black start if the grid goes down, how to start it back up again. I'd
right.
already mentioned transmission and distribution deferral, which is a little bit more like time shifting, but there's a ton of different ways that you can use these energy storage systems. And as more and more inverters become part of the grid, like plain old solar inverters and wind to a great degree too, are just grid following, which means you just inject power into the grid or you don't. And you don't have this inertia that you do have with the energy storage system, which they call it inertia because it's like some big spinning piece of machinery like you have with a coal plant. And they talk about the inverter-based grid or inverter-based resources, IBRs. And then the new thing that we're hearing more and more about are grid forming inverters. And so that would be an inverter that does supply inertia. And then you could actually not even have these spinning things on the grid that we have to have in a lot of the areas in the United States, probably all the areas of the United States. If it was just solar that was on, the grid wouldn't work. You need something to kind of be like the bass player and the drummer and the band to get that beat going.
Yeah,
60 hertz, which is a pretty fast beat, faster than any drummer I know.
right. Absolutely. And so I want to be able to help people understand or help utilities understand how do you extend that relationship of reliability and resiliency beyond just the grid assets? Like, is there a business model that we can enter into where, resiliency could be brought to the site itself in some way? And, we just saw all these disasters that came through with the Hurricane Helene and Hurricane Milton.
Which is happening right this minute, just to date us.
So, from a battery perspective, as we move to more electric transportation, how do we consider that? Because, in a hurricane, I just heard Governor DeSantis say that they were trucking in gas to gas stations to make sure people were properly fueled to get out of town. And they were getting police escorts to the gas stations in order to do that, right? If everybody starts to charge their battery, their Teslas or their EVs to get out of town, what does that do to the grid? And then when you restore, in the past, mobility was, a different department. Now mobility is going to be part of the utility responsibility in some way. So how does a city or anyone else respond to those kind of things? And I think those are still questions that we'll be answering for a while. But yeah, there's a need for batteries just about everywhere as we electrify.
That sounds pretty crazy to be driving a tank full of gas when a hurricane's coming at you. That would keep you awake. You wouldn't need to have any coffee that day.
This was prior to the hurricane because they were trying to move millions of people outside of Tampa up
Yeah, some
north.
of those are my relatives.
Well, are they okay?
I think they got out of town early,
Oh, good.
well ahead of time from what I heard. Yeah.
Yeah, and it happens here all along the Gulf Coast, right? When you have 2 million people moving north to Dallas and Austin and other parts, and you only have, so many charging areas and charging stations, what kind of chaos does that cause?
Yeah, yeah. I guess
So,
there's no good solution to that, but perhaps all this renewable energy, though, will slow down the increasing intensities of these weather events and the sea level. The sea level is kind of a I think it's pretty much scientifically proven that the sea level's going up, that most everybody agrees on that part at least. And so that makes the hurricanes a lot more damaging.
We also have to remember, though, that even if we make the switch overnight, it takes time to slow the changes that are already in place, right? Because carbon is in the air 100, 200 years.
Yeah, that's got a long half-life. Yep.
Yeah. So even if we stop emitting, there's enough there that it's going to be a problem for a while. And that's the other sociological part of it, right? If we could stop overnight and people are going to be still saying, hey, look, we stopped and nothing happened.
Hmm.
So, that's the line that we're walking. That's the fine line that we're walking.
Yeah, it's hard to have 200 years worth of patience.
Absolutely.
I don't know anybody that has that kind of patience.
Well, and we need to also consider resiliency now as part of the innovation world that we're in. And there's plenty of people doing that. But that is definitely in the public sector. We need to better understand that resiliency now is just as important from a climate change perspective. Because how do you help people, how do you help our children exist and thrive in that new world?
Well, move them up to Alaska.
Canada will start growing more wheat.
Yeah. What's funny is I used to live in Alaska for a little bit. My brother's from there. That's why I was staying there. And he's a wildlife biologist. But because of the glaciers melting so fast, the land is lifting up. And so they actually have the opposite of sea level rise. The sea is not rising as fast as the land.
Yeah.
And so people that have property that's right on the ocean are getting more property because it's based off of mean high tide. And it's kind of relevant. I think it might be something like an inch a year or something like that. I mean, it's kind of a lot.
Well, if we think about the effects of climate change, right? I don't know that it's an extinction event. I think it's more of a shifting event that's going to be extremely expensive. And it's moving people inland. It's supply chains having to shift according to where those new growth areas are going to be. It's going to be, we're seeing it through insurance rates right now, through the people that are paying for it, or, it's the everyday people through increases in pricing and being able to move and being able to be mobile.
Yeah, migration. Yeah.
That migration is where the cost of climate change really is. And I don't know how much we've put a number on that, but when we talk about the cost of the transition, we ignore the alternative, which is the cost of the migration as a result of climate change.
Yeah, and then there's all this political talk about the border and all that kind of stuff. And I wonder how much of that does have to do with, changing climate. I've heard about that too, with like stuff in the Middle East, but I think some of those are touchy subjects to be talking about.
I'd rather not talk about those subjects on this
Yeah,
podcast.
yeah, I think so
But
myself
yeah,
also. But I mentioned that they're out there and there's theories that it does have to do with climate.
I think there are enough things to talk about that we don't need to go down that path that are still a strong case for moving in the direction that we need to move.
Yeah.
And those things that you talked about, those are why we have to do it from a national security standpoint. But, like we said at the beginning of the podcast, there's multiple reasons why we should be moving in this. And if we only focus on one and trying to prove ourselves right on that one thing, we ignore the other things, and that's where we start to disagree. And so if we both agree that, hey, we both want to sell more batteries and one person wants to sell it for national security and economic reasons, while another person wants to sell it for climate change, we're both selling batteries.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. Like there's people of all political persuasions and in the solar industry and the renewable energy industry. And whatever they're doing, they're helping with climate change, whether they believe it or not.
Absolutely.
And we don't want to scare them away from it. And another thing that's been really interesting to me too is for so long, California has been half of the solar installed in the whole country. And Texas just took number one spot. And I think Florida is even at number two. And that was pretty sudden and unexpected. Like Texas and Florida, I don't even think they were in the top 10 for the longest time. And so here's to them.
I think Texas now is number one from a utility. Like California, if you look at the makeup of the California installations, quite a few of them are behind the meter or residential or, consumer tied. In Texas, most of the installations have been very large farms that are serving a very specific purpose on the generation side.
Yeah, I think about 2/3 of the solar in the country is utility scale.
Yeah. And the duration of the ones being installed in Texas are 1 to 2 hours.
Oh, for the batteries. Yeah.
Yeah, for the batteries, whereas California is closer to the 4 hour battery duration. So higher discharge rates in Texas versus California because of how the batteries are being used. And that's because the markets here favor that. There's so much arbitrage opportunity from all the renewable wind and the high demand. And so in the near term, or at least for now, that's creating the opportunity for battery storage. And, that's been the main difference.
Okay. One more thing I just wanted to ask you about with the energy storage systems from Cold Electric. Do they include the inverters, or are you focusing just on the batteries?
So for now, we're focusing on the batteries. We are working with different companies on inverters for the residential system and the commercial system. But, it's a bring your own inverter kind of a model. We have the battery. You tell us if there's a preferred inverter that you like. If you don't, then we'll quote you one from one of our partners.
Great. Well, that's kind of a good business plan too, because then you become friends with the inverter companies instead of working against them. And so maybe you could just tell us where to find out more about Cold Electric and about yourself, and we can leave this in the show notes too.
Sure. So right now we're selling through me basically. So if they're interested in a battery, we're selling a grid containerized system. The residential system is not yet available in the US, nor is the commercial or the data center. So right now we're selling a containerized system, 2.1 megawatt hour nominal product, and it's available through me. You can email me at david@coldelectric.com and just let me know where you found me and we'll talk.
Awesome. Okay. Well, I really liked our conversation. We went over how long we usually go, and I think that's just because it was an interesting intellectual conversation. And I was thinking maybe we could do this again in a year or two, something like that, just to kind of follow up. We could listen to what we talked about and see where the future did bring us. That might be kind of fun. Great. Yeah. And then I hope to just run into you somewhere too.
Absolutely.
Maybe one of these solar shows.
Where are you located?
Oh, I'm in the San Francisco Bay Area, but I go to all the big solar shows, or I should say solar and storage shows. That's just an old habit.
Well, I missed you at RE Plus. We were a bit busy just kind of scouting and looking at things.
Yeah, that's how I get to. What I did is just my last day, the Thursday, I met everybody at Starbucks that wanted to have a meeting, just back to back.
This show was interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll probably be back at RE Plus Texas. I was there last time too, so I imagine since you're in Texas, maybe you'll be there.
Austin show in March?
No, it was not in Austin. I guess it was in Houston.
Where is it this year? I think it's Austin this year. Oh, Intersolar is Austin this year. Sorry.
Oh yeah, Intersolar, yeah. Yeah, and I did talk to them. I don't know how big that's going to be, but I did talk to them about having me teach a class there. So that I hope that happens, but I'll more likely than not be at the RE Plus in Texas again this year too, which would be in Houston. Yeah.
Okay.
Great.
Sounds good.
I'm going to definitely be at Intersolar in San Diego. So
Okay.
great. All right.
All right.
Okay. Thank you so much, David Chen. Thanks for listening to Sean White's Solar and Energy Storage Podcast. Learn more, take my classes. Over and out. See you, David.